There was a time when these two men seemed to live in completely different worlds. One built a career in Hollywood through violence, controversy, and brutal honesty. The other built a media empire preaching positivity from a polished stage inside one of America's largest churches. And yet somehow, their names ended up in the same conversation. Not because of friendship. Because of disappointment. When Mel Gibson finally broke his silence about Joel Osteen, the reaction wasn't explosive at first. There was no screaming interview. No viral confrontation. No dramatic television showdown. It was quieter than that. And honestly, that made it worse. Because Gibson's criticism hit a nerve many people were already feeling but rarely said out loud. Especially after years of scandals, questions about wealth, and growing skepticism around celebrity pastors in America. The uncomfortable part. This story isn't really about religion. It's about branding, power, money, and what happens when faith starts looking suspiciously similar to entertainment. To understand why this matters now, you have to understand the strange rise of Joel Osteen himself. Back in 1999, Osteen wasn't supposed to become the face of modern American Christianity. His father, John Osteen, founded Lakewood Church in Houston decades earlier, but Joel stayed mostly behind the scenes working in television production. He didn't preach much. He avoided attention. By all accounts, he looked more comfortable holding a camera than standing behind a pulpit. Then his father died suddenly. And overnight, everything changed. Joel stepped onto the stage almost by accident. Soft-spoken, clean-cut, smiling constantly. He didn't sound like the fire and brimstone televangelists Americans were used to. No shouting about sin. No terrifying warnings about hell. His sermons sounded more like motivational speeches mixed with self-help psychology. And people loved it. Actually, loved might be too small a word. They consumed it. Lakewood Church exploded in popularity. Television deals followed. Best-selling books followed. Stadium-sized audiences followed. Eventually, services moved into the former home arena of the Houston Rockets. A basketball stadium became a church, which, depending on who you ask, was either inspiring or deeply symbolic. Because the production value started looking less like ministry and more like a live media corporation. Huge screens, lighting rigs, camera cranes, merchandise, publishing deals. At one point, Joel Osteen's books were selling in numbers most Hollywood celebrities would envy. And then came the money. Reports estimated Osteen's net worth in the tens of millions. His mansion in Houston became public conversation. Critics began asking uncomfortable questions. How does a pastor become this wealthy while preaching hope to struggling families? Osteen always defended himself carefully. He claimed his wealth came mostly from book sales, not church salary. Technically, that may be true. But perception doesn't care about technicalities. Especially in America. Especially during economic hardship. Especially when viewers sitting in tiny apartments are watching a preacher smile from a multimillion-dollar stage. And that's where the tension started building. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. Like pressure under concrete. Now enter Mel Gibson. And if there's one thing Gibson has never really been good at, it's pretending. His career has always carried contradiction. Brilliant actor. Respected director. Wildly successful filmmaker. But also controversial. Self-destructive. Publicly explosive. Sometimes deeply polarizing. Hollywood never fully knew what to do with him. One year he's winning awards. The next year he's being recorded in scandals that nearly destroy his reputation. But there's another side to Gibson people often forget. Faith matters to him. Deeply. Not in the polished celebrity way. Not in the social media quote-posting way. Gibson's relationship with religion has always seemed intense. Serious. Sometimes even unsettling. When he directed The Passion of the Christ in 2004, most Hollywood executives thought the movie would fail spectacularly. It was violent. Subtitled. Deeply religious. Almost entirely outside mainstream studio logic. Instead, it became a phenomenon. Over $600 million worldwide. A religious film making blockbuster money. Hollywood executives couldn't believe it. But Gibson's success also gave him a strange kind of authority in conversations about faith and media. He had seen firsthand what happened when religion became spectacle. And according to people close to these discussions, that's exactly why Joel Osteen bothered him. Not because Osteen was religious. Because Gibson believed something essential was missing. Suffering. Sacrifice. Accountability. The harder parts. Osteen's message often centered on prosperity, optimism, and personal breakthrough. Gibson's worldview seemed almost the opposite. Darker. More severe. More focused on pain and redemption. The contrast between them became impossible to ignore. One man preached comfort. The other believed truth was uncomfortable by nature. Then came 2017. Hurricane Harvey slammed into Houston. Thousands of families were displaced. Floodwaters swallowed neighborhoods. Desperate residents searched for shelter. And suddenly, Lakewood Church became the center of a national backlash. Social media exploded with accusations that the massive church had initially refused to open its doors to victims. The optics were catastrophic. A church with enormous space. People stranded outside. And online outrage moving at the speed of gasoline hitting fire. Lakewood eventually opened, and church representatives disputed parts of the criticism, claiming flooding and safety concerns complicated the situation. But by then, the damage was done. Because public opinion had already chosen its narrative. And this is where Mel Gibson's comments started gaining traction again. Not because he launched some massive attack, but because audiences suddenly viewed his skepticism differently. What once sounded harsh now sounded plausible. The criticism wasn't really about one building during one hurricane. It was about something larger. People began asking whether modern celebrity pastors had become too insulated from ordinary struggle. Too wealthy. Too polished. Too media-trained. And the weirdest part? Joel Osteen's greatest strength may have also become his biggest weakness. His calmness. Think about it. No matter what controversy appears, Osteen rarely changes emotionally. Same smile. Same tone. Same carefully measured positivity. At first, audiences found that reassuring. Over time, some found it eerie. Almost corporate. Like customer service spirituality. Meanwhile, Gibson remained the exact opposite. Messy. Emotional. Sometimes reckless. But undeniably human. That contrast fascinated audiences. Because humans instinctively distrust perfection after a while. Especially manufactured perfection. And the timing couldn't have been worse for Osteen. America was already changing. Trust in institutions was collapsing everywhere. Media. Politics. Corporations. Religion. Megachurch culture started facing heavier scrutiny. Viewers noticed the private jets. Designer sneakers. Luxury lifestyles. Some pastors looked less like spiritual leaders and more like CEOs with stage lighting. Critics began calling prosperity preaching a business model disguised as ministry. And honestly, once people start seeing it that way, it's difficult to unsee. That's the hidden mechanism underneath this entire story. Attention. Modern religion in America competes in the same economy as entertainment. Views matter. Charisma matters. Books matter. Brand image matters. A pastor today doesn't just deliver sermons. He manages perception across television, publishing, streaming, social media, and public relations. In other words, the system rewards likability, not necessarily depth. And that's exactly where someone like Mel Gibson becomes dangerous to the machine. Because Gibson doesn't speak the language of branding very well. He disrupts things. Even accidentally. Especially accidentally. When Gibson questioned watered-down spirituality and feel-good religion, people listened differently because he came from outside the megachurch ecosystem. He wasn't protecting the industry. And audiences can sense that. Now, to be fair, Joel Osteen still has millions of supporters. Many people genuinely feel helped by his messages. They see him as uplifting during difficult times. His defenders argue critics misunderstand his purpose entirely. They say not every preacher needs to focus on fear, guilt, or condemnation. And they have a point. But critics respond with another question. At what point does positivity become avoidance? That's the uncomfortable line sitting underneath this entire debate. Because suffering exists whether motivational branding acknowledges it or not. And strangely enough, this tension mirrors Hollywood itself. That's the irony. Mel Gibson spent decades inside an industry built on image management, narrative control, and emotional packaging. Then he looked at parts of modern televangelism and appeared to recognize the exact same mechanics. Stagecraft, audience psychology, mass appeal, revenue streams. The overlap became hard to ignore. Even the buildings started looking similar. Megachurches with arena seating, concert lighting, merchandise tables, VIP experiences. At times it feels less like traditional worship and more like a highly optimized live event. Again, supporters would argue that using modern tools to spread faith isn't inherently wrong. And they're right. But Gibson's criticism cuts deeper than architecture or money. It questions authenticity itself. Can faith survive once it becomes a mass-market product? Or does the system slowly reshape the message into something safer, softer, more profitable? Because that's what industries do. Hollywood does it. Politics does it. Media does it. Maybe religion isn't immune either. And perhaps that's why this story continues resonating years later. Not because audiences are obsessed with celebrity feuds, but because people are trying to figure out who, if anyone, is still telling the truth. The polished preacher with the permanent smile, or the deeply flawed actor whose life has often looked like a cautionary tale. Oddly enough, many viewers no longer trust either completely. And maybe that's the final twist here. This was never really a battle between good and bad. It was a collision between two different versions of modern faith. One optimistic and marketable. The other painful and confrontational. One built for stadiums. The other built from personal chaos. And somewhere between them sits the audience, trying to decide which version feels more real. Because in an era where everything becomes content eventually, even spirituality starts competing for attention. And once faith enters the entertainment machine, one terrifying question quietly appears in the background. If belief itself becomes a brand, how do you know when you're being inspired? And when you're simply being marketed to?